We come to a text this morning that is one that's quite honest, it's difficult to understand, and I think the reason it's difficult to understand has to do with the fact that there are layers to it. There are layers to this text that we sort of have to read on two planes. We have to read on two different levels, if we might even say. It's not about a secret reading or a reading that we want to force on the text, but I think the text is operating at two levels, because what we see is Jesus is addressing what happens at the end. You remember this whole section is Jesus answering the questions that the disciples ask. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus finally answers that question beginning in this section. And he uses this language, and scholars debate whether what's the meaning of this language, this language of the sun darkening and the moon not shedding its light. And some make a case that this is referring to political fall. It's the fall of Israel. It's the fall of kingdom. This language does occur in Isaiah about the fall of kingdoms and judgment. And so there's this earthly reading, we might say. But then there is this heavenly, this cosmic reading where it's a literal, the sun is darkening and the stars are falling out of the sky and the powers of the heavens are shaken. So we might say, which is it? Is it more of the earthly reading, or is it more of the heavenly, the cosmic reading? And I think it's both. And so I want to say that up front, that regardless of where we land on it, it's not really something we need to sort out today. You do your own study and figure it out. But there is a sense in which we all know what the end of the world feels like. And you know how we know that? Well, let me ask you, have you ever felt like the world was going to end? Let me rephrase it a different way. Have you ever felt like your world was going to end? That you were convinced this is it. This is where it all comes crashing down. I mean, think about the language that's being used here. The sun will be darkened. What do we depend on the sun for? Well, we depend on the sun for light and life. We depend on it for direction. How do we know where east and west is? Well, it's by the rising and the setting of the sun. We receive heat from it. So all of those things we depend on. What about the stars? Well, the stars give us direction as well. We navigate, well, at least we used to. We navigate by the stars. They tell us where we are, our place in the universe, that we see them and they speak to us. What about the moon? The moon is cyclical. It gives us a sense of rhythm. It gives us a sense of that there are cycles to creation. There's a pattern woven into creation. And what about the powers of the heavens? Well, those could be the actual things in the heavens, or it could be the people in charge, the beings in charge. But understand what's being portrayed here is what happens when everything that makes sense, everything that gives you a sense of direction, everything that you look to in your life to give meaning and purpose, what happens when it all goes away? What do you do when you feel like the end is near? When your world's going to collapse? When the walls are going to come tumbling down? That's the question we want to ask. And I think as we look at this text, we see that Jesus answers this question on these different levels. For what does it mean when a political or a civil end takes place? Or what does it mean at the end of all things when Jesus returns? But then what does it mean when we find ourselves in those moments in our life where we feel like this is the end? How could this not be the end? It's all going to collapse now. To do that, I want us to look at this text. And what I want you to see is that there are three characteristics of Christ's return that we want to look at. And these will lead us into our central truth that we'll get to towards the end. But there are three characteristics of Christ's return that we see as he talks about his return in this passage. And the first one is in verse 29. It is the scope of Jesus' return. I want you to see the scope of Jesus' return. You notice that the world is portrayed, and creation and the cosmos and everything that gives our life meaning is portrayed as coming to end. The sun is darkened. The moon does not shed its light. The stars fall from the sky, and the powers of the heaven will be shaken. Those are the four things, right? But notice what you have here. You sort of have a sandwich. And notice the language here. What happens and you have the sun darkening, then the moon, then the stars, then the powers of the heavens. On both bookends, what do you see? Well, you see this language, the sun will be darkened. And then look at the other end of the sandwich. The heavens will be shaken. And that raises the obvious question. By whom? You see, the language here implies that someone's doing the acting. Someone is going to the sun as if it were a light switch and going off. Someone is approaching the powers of the heavens, the entire cosmos, and saying, take a break. So what does that say about the end of the world, the end of the age? Listen, it means that there is a scope that goes beyond the end. When you feel like, you say, Jason, you don't understand. When I am in the middle of the world collapsing around me, I can't see beyond that. Well, that's because your scope might be too narrow. You see, what is being portrayed here is when it comes to the end, there are hands around the end. There are brackets around the end. When God brings an end to something, it is not an uncontrolled chaos. It is God's sovereign, gracious, good hand that is wrapped literally on both sides of bringing the world, the age, to a conclusion. There is a scope of power here that we can barely wrap our minds around. And it's not just in a nation. And it's not just even the earth. What does it say? That the sun, the moon, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. When Jesus comes back, it's not just the end of an age in the sense of on earth. It is the end of an age of the universe. When Jesus comes back, it will be the start of a new age. It will be the start of the age where God sets up his kingdom on earth fully. Jesus will set foot and he will put it into sin and death and hell, and it will all be remade. It will all be made new. It's not just an earthly renewal, it's a cosmic renewal. The entire universe will be washed and cleansed and renewed and made as it is supposed to be. So there's a scope to Jesus' return that we need to reckon with. And you say, Jason, I get what you're saying but you don't understand where I'm at. You don't understand that I am in the largest room in the world, the waiting room. In fact, every single one of us, when we feel like the world is going to collapse, we can find ourselves somewhere in here. And I want to point out to you where it is. Go to the end of verse 29. Find the last word. You got it? What comes after that last word? What's that little dot? A semicolon or a period? Okay. What comes after that? Nope. What is it? Huh? No. What comes after the colon or the period? Space. Isn't that the hardest place to be? Jason, my world, it's collapsed, and I am just floating in the void of the space between the end of verse 29 and the beginning of verse 30. Sometimes that space is hours. Sometimes that space is days. Sometimes that space is months. Sometimes it's years, where you feel that everything has come crashing down. There is a scope to Jesus' return that you need to understand, that even in that space, doesn't mean that he's forgotten. Doesn't mean that he's unaware. In fact, if you will believe it, there's a grace in that space. There's a mercy in that space. The scope of Jesus' return is bigger than sometimes we remember, and it's deeper than sometimes we are even aware of. If you ever feel like you've hit the bottom, understand Jesus was there first, and Jesus is underneath the bottom you hit. So the first characteristic of Christ's return is the scope of it. It is cosmic. It is all-consuming. But then we want to look at verse 30 and look at the status of Jesus' return. The status of Jesus' return. You see in verse 30 it says, Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. It's almost as if God turns down the lights so that all the focus, all the attention is on His Son. He says, listen, I don't want anybody thinking they compare with what they're about to see. So dim the lights, dim the sun, dim the moon, stars. Y'all get off the stage. Everybody look at what's coming. And what is it? The sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. What does that mean? Well, it could be His appearing Himself, but most likely it is the reference to what we would call an ensign or an ancient or a military banner. His flag will appear in the sky. What kind of flag? The flag that flies when an army is approaching. The kind of flag that flies when someone is coming to conquer. And we see this as in the Old Testament, this is in the same context of, you see in verse 31, the loud trumpet. The flag and the trumpet, they picture military conquest. So there is a status to Jesus' return. When He comes, it's not because He's coming to hang out. He's coming to conquer. He's coming to finally put an end to the sin and the rebellion. And that's partly why Jesus says in verse 30, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn. So let's go ahead and say one thing. It's a literal return. Notice Jesus says, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear. You will see it, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn. They will know what it is. And we hear echoes of Zechariah's prophecy. If you go look at Zechariah 12:10, talks about they will see, they will look on Him whom they have pierced, and they will mourn. So Jesus comes back literally. It's a literal return, a bodily return, and all the peoples of the earth will see it and mourn. And then what does He say? They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. That's the status of His return. It is a return with power and great glory. What's interesting about this is Daniel 7 talks about the Son of Man being on the clouds of heaven and coming, and that's the fulfillment of this. Jesus is the Son of Man of Daniel 7. But notice that they will see Him riding on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, with authority. This is not Jesus showing up on a donkey like He did the first time. And this is not Jesus pulling up in a minivan. This is not Jesus casually walking in sandals and, this is, riding on a cloud. That's pretty, you have to have some kind of power to be able to do that. Some kind of authority and control over the cosmos. I don't know about you, but if you've ever been on a plane and you've ever looked at a cloud, you can't stand on it. You can't just be on a cloud. You have to control it. So there is a status that He comes with the clouds of heaven. These are heavenly clouds with power and great glory. So we have the world coming, the age coming to an end, when everything falls apart in verse 29. And then verse 30, what does that give way to? It gives way to demonstrating the power and the glory of Christ. Now here's where it starts to hurt, but we need to press into the hurt. What if God wants to bring your world down so that it might display the power and glory of Jesus? What if Jesus wants to bring and burn your kingdom down so that His power and glory might be seen? It's a penetrating question, isn't it? Is it worth it to me to lose everything, but it means that I get Jesus? Is it worth it to me to go through the labor pains, to go through the persecution? I mean, you remember the context, right? Of labor pains, betrayal, persecution, tribulation. You don't think when that stuff happens, you feel like the world's ending? That your world's crashing down around you? But what if it's then that you see God's power and glory in Christ displayed in your life? I don't know about you, but that's a possibility that we need to reconcile in our minds. Have it sorted out now. And if you're not there today, and I'm not trying to say that it's an easy decision. It's a painful thing. But what if it shows the status of who Jesus is? That His power is made perfect in weakness. That His glory is displayed. That we must decrease so that He may increase. The status of Jesus' return is one of power and glory. We know what Job says, right? Blessed be the Lord who gives. Well, we like that one. We like that part, don't we? Blessed be the Lord who gives. But what does Job say? Blessed be the Lord who gives and takes away. So the world comes crashing down around us, but it's not out of control. It's not out of God's sovereign and gracious hand. And sometimes God may bring about the end so that it displays the status of Jesus' power and glory. And when Jesus comes, it will be seen. But then there's a third characteristic that we need to see, and that is the security of Jesus' return. The security of Jesus' return. In verse 31, we see this. There is a certain security about it all. It says, He, that is Jesus, will send out His angels with a loud trumpet. The trumpet sounds, it signals a command. It's the work whistle. Angels, do what it is I have commanded you to do. And what is that? And they, now pay attention here, they will gather His elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Jesus has been talking about that many will fall away, that many will be led astray, that many will fall for false messiahs, that there will be persecutions, there will be hardships, that one day this age will come to an end and He will return. And if we're all a little honest, that makes us a little nervous, doesn't it? Makes us a little nervous. How do I know that between verse 29 and verse 31, I'm not going to get lost in the space or lost in the void, or that when it all comes crashing down, that I won't walk away? What part in verse 31 do you actually do anything? You see, God's sovereign hands are all over bringing the end about. so that it might raise up and exalt and display the power of Jesus Christ. And that glory and power is further displayed by the fact that during all of that, not one single of his people are lost. Did you catch that? He's going to blow a trumpet. The angels will go out. They will gather his. You don't gather yourself on that day. You don't book a reservation to say, I need to make sure I don't miss that flight up to meet Jesus in the air. You don't get on an app and secure your seat. No, the angels make sure you get there under the command of God. And not just that, notice it says that they will gather his elect from the four winds. What does that mean? Four winds. Well, it's a reference to the compass, north, south, east, west. So here's the picture. No matter where you are, no matter what's going on, no matter how bad the things are, when it comes to it, God himself, Jesus, will make sure that his people are with him. The world will collapse around you, but you have the security that on the other side, Jesus will bring you all the way through it, and you will be with him. There is a security here. He says from the four winds, like we read in Revelation, people from every tongue, people, tribe, language, nation, from one end of the sky to the other, not a single one will be lost. There is a security in Jesus' return. So what do we do with that? We started out with the collapse and we end with being with Christ. What are we to do with that? All of this, the scope of Jesus' return, the status of it, the security of it. What does it mean? Well, if you leave here with nothing else, I hope you know this. This is today's main idea, the big truth for today. Because Jesus returns with power and glory at the end of the age, believers should live with hopeful expectation. Hopeful expectation. Because Jesus returns with power and glory at the end of the age, believers should live with hopeful expectation. With hopeful expectation. I want to spend our last few minutes on these two ideas, the hopeful part and the expectation part. You see, when we get to the end of this passage, we're going to transition in verse 32 into the application of everything that Jesus says. And it's all about, there is that day coming, so how do you live in light of it? But before he tells us what we ought to do, we know that we are to have a hopeful expectation. So let's look at this hopeful part. What is hopeful about this text? What's hopeful about it is that we are assured of God's grace to us in Christ, bringing us through to be with Jesus at the end of all things. I think, in contrast to how this text is often understood as fear-inducing, as something that is meant to be sort of a fire and brimstone, it actually, for believers at least, is a tremendous comfort. It's a tremendous comfort. That no matter what happens, as frail as we are, when everything falls around us, we cry out, we're unsure, we're scared, we're doubting, we try to solve it ourselves, we make things worse, then we try to make it better again. All of that is wrapped up in this, that though the end comes, Jesus will see his people through it. So instead of living with a fearful expectation, we live with a hopeful expectation. A hopeful expectation is a one that motivates. How are you motivated by the return of Jesus? Is the return of Jesus something that scares you? Let me put it this way. Where is the friction? Where is the friction with what we've just said? What area of your life, what thing in your life, what situation in your life, do you hear what we've said and there's friction. You say, Jason, I hear what you're saying, but my circumstance is different. Is it? If it's true that the end of the age is really just a controlled demolition in order to rebuild the creation into what it's supposed to be, you think God can't do something with your finances? That God can't do something with your marriage? That God can't do something with how you're raising your children or with your children? No, there is a hopeful expectation that there may feel like the end, but the end is not the end. Our text doesn't end in verse 29, does it? No. There's a hopeful expectation. So not only is there the hopeful part, but then there's the expectation. And we don't want to have to spend too much time on this because I think the rest of Matthew 24 is all about this, but we know Jesus is coming back, and it could be today. Could be in an hour. We don't know when. So what does Jesus spend the rest of the chapter? Learn the lesson of the fig tree. You can see the signs. No one knows the day and the hour. Therefore, be alert. You are to be ready. And then, blessed is the servant whom the master finds doing his job when he comes. This hopeful expectation means that we ought to live as people who believe that no matter what happens, God will bring about his ends. That we might labor for Jesus and know that the end is already secure. Sometimes I think we're scared to do for Jesus because we say, well, it might end in failure, or it might collapse, or it might make my life harder, or it might do something that I really don't know that I can make it through. If I start serving the Lord and living for Him and letting Him have control over everything, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if I'll survive. I hear these stories. You're talking about persecution. You're talking about death. You're talking about betrayal. If I sign up for that, how do I know? Well, you'll make it because of what we just seen. A hopeful expectation that when He returns, we will be with Him. And so there is great comfort. There is great comfort that we live in hopeful expectation. And here's where we need to get down to where the rubber meets the road in very basic terms. The great comfort we have in this is not rooted in your faithfulness. It's not rooted in how well you live by this. It's rooted in the gospel. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to connect the dots with everything we've said before that with what the gospel promises us. The gospel says that we were sinners. Back up. That's the bad news. Gospel means good news. The bad news is we're sinners. We've disobeyed God. We deserve to be grouped in with the people who mourn, the people who are the conquered, the people who are cast into hell and judgment for eternity. But Jesus, in His first coming, lives a perfect life. He dies on the cross. He takes the punishment for our sins, and the wrath of God, the righteous wrath, the fair and just wrath of God is poured out on Him in my place and in the place of all who believe in Him. And it's exhausted. He drinks it fully. You know, what's interesting, it just comes to my mind. Jesus talks about the sun being darkened and the moon not shedding its light. At the crucifixion and the world's response, that's essentially what the world was trying to do. You have Him who is the light of the world, the Son, who is fully God and fully man. What is man? Man is the reflection, the image of God. So here you have Jesus who is sun and moon, fully God, fully man, and the powers of the heavens try to dim Him, and yet Jesus rises from the dead. He is the one who gets to determine when the sun goes off and when the moon goes off. He is the one who accomplishes this for us. So the first coming promises us that Jesus did everything necessary for us to be saved, to have hope. That hope carries through to the second coming. Jesus has done everything. Jesus does everything for us to meet the end with hopeful expectation. So there is great comfort, and it's rooted not in how well you perform in verse 39, not in how great you are in the space between 29 and 30, not in anything other than God chose you. God loved you. God sent His Son for you. His Son bought you. His Spirit made you alive with Christ, sealed you, and will keep you until that day. Believer, Jesus is coming back one day with great power and glory. Let's live with hopeful expectation in the meantime.